In August 1953, when the Korean War finally ended with an armistice, American prisoners of war began their journey home. They had endured years in communist captivity, suffered through brutal winters, disease, starvation, and a psychological assault, unlike anything American military personnel had experienced before. The nation waited to welcome them home as heroes. But then came a shock that stunned America. 21 American soldiers announced they did not want to return to the United States. They wanted to stay in communist China. They had been, in the terminology that suddenly entered the American vocabulary, brainwashed. This is the story of what happened to American POWs in Korea, how the communists waged psychological warfare against them, how some men broke while others resisted, and how 21 young Americans made a choice that their country could barely comprehend. The capture of American soldiers in Korea began almost immediately when North Korea invaded in June 1950. In those early desperate days, as American and South Korean forces retreated down the peninsula toward Busan, units were cut off and surrounded. Men surrendered when they ran out of ammunition or when their positions were overrun. The North Koreans took these prisoners north, marching them toward camps in the northern part of the country. The treatment was brutal from the start. North Korean guards beat prisoners, denied them food and water, and sometimes executed those who could not keep up on the forced marches. Then came the Chinese intervention in November 1950, and suddenly there were tens of thousands more prisoners. When Chinese forces surrounded UN troops at the Chosin Reservoir and elsewhere, many Americans were captured. The massive Chinese offensive pushed UN forces south, and in the chaos, more men were taken prisoner. By early 1951, there were thousands of American POWs in camps scattered across North Korea, most of them in the northern regions near the Chinese border. The camps were unlike the POW camps of World War II. American prisoners who had heard stories from their fathers or uncles about German POW camps, where conditions were often reasonable and the Geneva Conventions were generally followed, discovered that communist captors had different ideas. The Chinese and North Koreans did not just want to hold prisoners until the war ended. They wanted to use the prisoners for propaganda purposes. They wanted to break them down psychologically, to make them question their beliefs, to turn them into tools of communist propaganda. The physical conditions in the camps were horrific. Prisoners lived in crude huts or buildings with no heat during the brutal Korean winters. They slept on bare floors or on thin mats. Food was scarce and poor quality. The standard diet was millet, a grain most Americans had never eaten, often mixed with sorghum or a thin soup. Sometimes there were vegetables, usually spoiled. Meat was almost non-existent. The portions were deliberately kept small, enough to keep prisoners alive, but not healthy. Malnutrition became universal. Disease ran rampant through the camps. Dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, beriberi from vitamin deficiency, all of these killed prisoners by the hundreds. Medical care was essentially non-existent. The Chinese and North Koreans made no effort to provide adequate medical treatment. Prisoners who became seriously ill simply died. In the first winter of 1950 to 1951, the death rate in some camps approached 40%. Men died from cold, disease, starvation, and despair. But the physical hardships, terrible as they were only part of the story. The communists were conducting an experiment in psychological warfare, trying to break down American prisoners and remake them. The Chinese, particularly, had a sophisticated program of what they called reeducation, but what Americans would come to call brainwashing. The term brainwashing entered the English language because of the Korean War. It was a translation of the Chinese term HSI now, which literally means wash brain, the idea of washing away old thoughts and replacing them with new ones. The Chinese program was based on several principles. First, they sought to isolate prisoners from their support systems. They separated prisoners by rank, keeping officers away from enlisted men. This broke down the military chain of command. Senior officers who might organize resistance were isolated or sent to separate camps. Within the camps, the Chinese created a system where prisoners were organized into small groups or squads. These groups became the basic unit of camp life, and the Chinese made sure to mix men from different units, breaking up friendships and unit loyalties. Second, the Chinese created an atmosphere of constant pressure and uncertainty. Prisoners never knew what would happen next, what the rules were, what was expected of them. Guards might be friendly one day and brutal the next. Punishments were arbitrary and unpredictable. This kept prisoners off balance, anxious, unable to establish any sense of stability or control over their lives. Third, the Chinese used a combination of rewards and punishments to shape prisoner behavior. Prisoners who cooperated, who attended indoctrination lectures without obvious resistance, who signed peace petitions or made statements criticizing American policy, received better food, warmer clothing, or easier work assignments. Those who resisted were punished. Punishment could mean solitary confinement in a tiny cold cell, denial of food, forced labor, or severe beatings. The Chinese were patient and methodical. They would work on a prisoner for weeks or months, gradually wearing down resistance. Fourth, the Chinese used indoctrination lectures and study groups. Every day, prisoners had to attend lectures on communist ideology, on the evils of American imperialism, on the superiority of the communist system. These lectures went on for hours. Prisoners were required to sit and listen, were not allowed to sleep or show disrespect. After the lectures, prisoners had to participate in study groups where they discussed what they had heard, criticized themselves for their wrong thoughts, and wrote self-criticisms admitting their errors. The content of these lectures was pure communist propaganda. America was portrayed as an imperialist aggressor, Korea as an innocent victim. The Chinese claimed that America had started the war, that American forces were committing atrocities, that capitalism exploited workers while communism liberated them. They hammered these themes over and over, day after day, week after week. The repetition was deliberate. The idea was to overwhelm prisoners with propaganda until they began to internalize it, or at least to mouth it to make the pressure stop. The self-criticism sessions were particularly insidious. Prisoners were required to write confessions of their crimes, to admit that they were war criminals, that they had committed atrocities or supported an unjust war. At first, most prisoners refused or wrote obvious nonsense, but the Chinese would reject these confessions and demand that prisoners write them again, and again, and again. Prisoners who refused were punished. Those who cooperated were rewarded. Over time, some prisoners began to write more elaborate confessions, inventing details to satisfy their captors. In doing so, they began to internalize the propaganda. The act of writing these confessions, even if they did not believe them at first, began to change how they thought. The Chinese also exploited divisions among the prisoners. They identified prisoners who seemed sympathetic to communist ideas or who were simply willing to cooperate to improve their conditions. These prisoners were given special privileges and were used to inform on other prisoners. The Chinese called them progressives. These progressives would attend more intensive indoctrination sessions, would write articles for communist propaganda publications, would make radio broadcasts denouncing American policy. In return, they received better food, better quarters, and better treatment. The existence of progressives created enormous tension in the camps. Other prisoners saw them as collaborators, as traitors, but the line between collaboration and survival was often blurred. Was it collaboration to attend the mandatory lectures? Was it collaboration to write a self-criticism to avoid punishment? Was it collaboration to sign a peace petition if everyone was being forced to sign? Different prisoners drew the line in different places, and the Chinese deliberately kept the situation ambiguous to maximize confusion and conflict among the prisoners. Some prisoners actively resisted. They refused to cooperate with indoctrination, refused to write self-criticisms, organized other prisoners to resist. These men, often called reactionaries by the Chinese, were targeted for special punishment. They were put in solitary confinement, denied food, beaten, subjected to extreme cold. Some died from the punishment. Others eventually broke under the pressure. A few maintained their resistance throughout their captivity, but they paid a terrible price. The most famous of the resistors was Colonel James Khan of the British Army, who commanded the Gloucestershire Regiment. Khan was captured in April 1951 after his unit was surrounded and destroyed in a heroic last stand. In captivity, Khan organized resistance among the officers, refused to cooperate with indoctrination, and maintained discipline and morale. The Chinese responded by putting him in solitary confinement for over 2 years. He was kept in a tiny cell, denied contact with other prisoners, given minimal food. He nearly died but never broke. His resistance became legendary among the prisoners. Among American prisoners, there were also heroes of resistance. Some senior NCOs and officers organized covert resistance, passing information, maintaining unit cohesion, encouraging others to resist. But there were also failures. Some senior officers and NCOs cooperated with the Chinese, either because they broke under pressure or because they calculated that cooperation would help them survive. The breakdown of military discipline and unit cohesion meant that junior enlisted men, often teenagers barely out of high school, were left to face psychological warfare without the support of their leaders. The Chinese paid particular attention to African American prisoners. They tried to exploit racial tensions in America, pointing out the discrimination and segregation that black soldiers faced at home. Why, the Chinese asked, were black soldiers fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens? Some black prisoners were receptive to this message, particularly those who had experienced severe discrimination. The Chinese offered them better treatment if they would make propaganda statements about racial injustice in America. A few did, though most black prisoners remained loyal and resisted just as their white counterparts did. The Chinese also targeted prisoners based on their background. They looked for prisoners from working-class backgrounds, from poor families, anyone who might have grievances against American society. They looked for prisoners with less education, thinking they would be easier to manipulate. They looked for prisoners who were isolated, who had no close friends in the camp, who were vulnerable to indoctrination. The Chinese were systematic and patient, studying each prisoner, looking for weaknesses to exploit. One technique the Chinese used was called lenient policy. They would tell prisoners that if they cooperated, if they admitted their crimes and showed remorse, they would be treated leniently. They would be sent home early or would receive better treatment in the camp. This was almost always a lie, but prisoners desperate to survive or to go home were sometimes willing to believe it. They would cooperate, would make confessions or propaganda statements, and then discover that the promised leniency never materialized. But by then, they had already compromised themselves, had already crossed a line, and it became harder to resist further demands. The Chinese also used a technique of gradual escalation. They would start with small requests, sign a peace petition, attend a lecture without causing trouble, write a short essay about your life. Each request seemed harmless, not worth resisting, but each small compliance made the next request easier to comply with. Over time, prisoners who had started with minor acts of cooperation found themselves doing things they never would have imagined. They were making radio broadcasts, writing articles for communist newspapers, denouncing their own country. It happened gradually, step by step, and many prisoners did not even realize how far they had gone until it was too late. The concept of brainwashing became a source of enormous concern in America. How could American soldiers, raised in a free democratic society, be turned into spokesmen for communism? It seemed to suggest that communism had some kind of dark power, some ability to control minds that America did not understand. In fact, what the Chinese were doing was not mysterious or supernatural. It was a systematic application of psychological pressure, using isolation, fear, reward, punishment, and repetition to break down resistance and shape behavior. It was effective not because it was magical, but because it was relentless, and because the prisoners were in a situation where they had no escape and no support. Not all prisoners broke. In fact, most did not become active collaborators. Most prisoners endured their captivity, did the minimum necessary to survive, and maintained their loyalty to America and their faith that they would eventually go home. But the minority who did collaborate, who became progressives, created a serious problem. They provided the communists with propaganda material, with confessions of American atrocities, with denunciations of American policy. This propaganda was used both in Korea and internationally to portray America as an aggressor and to undermine support for the war. One of the most notorious cases was that of Colonel Frank Schwabel, a Marine Corps aviator who was the senior Marine prisoner. Under intense pressure, including threats against other prisoners, Schwabel signed a confession admitting that American forces had used biological weapons in Korea. This was a lie. America had not used biological weapons, but Schwabel's confession, given his rank and position, was a propaganda coup for the communists. They publicized it widely, claiming it was proof of American war crimes. After the war, Schwabel faced a court of inquiry and explained the circumstances of his confession. He was not punished, the Marine Corps recognizing that he had broken under intolerable pressure, but the confession remained a source of controversy and shame. There were also numerous cases of enlisted men who cooperated with the Chinese. Some made radio broadcasts, some wrote articles, Some testified in show trials where they accused American forces of atrocities. After the war, the question of how to handle these men became a serious issue. Were they traitors who should be prosecuted, or were they victims of brainwashing who could not be held responsible for their actions? The military struggled with this question, ultimately prosecuting some of the more egregious collaborators while treating others more leniently. As the war dragged on and armistice negotiations began in 1951, the prisoner issue became central to the peace talks. One of the major sticking points was the question of repatriation. The communists insisted on forced repatriation, that all prisoners should be returned to their home country regardless of their wishes. The United States insisted on voluntary repatriation, that prisoners should have the choice of whether to return. This became a matter of principle for both sides. The armistice negotiations stalled for over a year largely because of this issue. The United States took the position of voluntary repatriation partly out of principle, belief in freedom of choice, and partly for propaganda purposes. Thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners held by UN forces did not want to return to communist rule. They feared execution or persecution if they went back. The United States wanted to allow these prisoners to choose, and it wanted to publicize the fact that so many communist prisoners preferred freedom. This would be a propaganda victory, showing that people preferred democracy to communism. But voluntary repatriation raised a troubling question. What if some American prisoners chose not to return? What if some had been so effectively indoctrinated that they wanted to stay in communist countries? This seemed almost unthinkable to American officials. They could not imagine that American soldiers, properly raised and trained, would voluntarily choose communism over America. But the Chinese were already working on this outcome, already identifying prisoners who might be willing to stay. In the spring of 1953, as armistice negotiations neared conclusion, the Chinese moved several dozen American prisoners to a special camp. These were the progressives, the prisoners who had been most cooperative, who had shown the most receptivity to communist ideas. The Chinese worked intensively with these prisoners, telling them they were welcome to stay in China, that they could build new lives there, that they would be treated well. Some of these prisoners had become true believers in communism. Others were confused, afraid of what would happen if they returned home, uncertain about their future. The Chinese worked on their fears and uncertainties, promising them a better life in China. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the prisoner exchange began. This was called Operation Big Switch. Thousands of prisoners were exchanged at Panmunjom, the truce village on the border between North and South Korea. American prisoners were brought south, given medical checks, debriefed by military intelligence, and then sent home. Chinese and North Korean prisoners were sent north. But as part of the agreement, prisoners who did not want to be repatriated were sent to a neutral zone where they would be held for a period and given the opportunity to change their minds. Representatives from their home countries would be allowed to try to persuade them to return. In September 1953, the shocking news broke. 23 American POWs had refused repatriation. 23 American soldiers said they did not want to go home. They wanted to go to China. America was stunned. How could this be? These were American boys, raised in America, who had fought for their country. How could they turn their backs on America and choose communism? The 23 included 21 regular soldiers and 2 soldiers who were of Hispanic origin and whose status was slightly different. All of them were young, mostly in their early 20s. Most were from working-class backgrounds. Several were from the South. A few had grown up in poverty. None had much education beyond high school. They were, in many ways, typical American enlisted men of the Korean War era. But they had been through the indoctrination program, had been progressives in the camps, and had been convinced, or had convinced themselves, that they did not want to return to America. The men were held in the neutral zone, an area controlled by Indian troops as part of the armistice agreement. American officials were given the opportunity to speak with the prisoners, to try to convince them to come home. General Mark Clark, the UN commander, sent representatives to talk to the men. These representatives tried to appeal to the prisoners' patriotism, to remind them of their families, to assure them they would not be prosecuted if they returned. But the 23 refused to see the representatives or walked out of the meetings. They had made their decision. The American public's reaction was a mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. How could American soldiers betray their country? What did this say about American society? Had we become so weak, so decadent, that our young men could be turned into communists? Conservative commentators blamed moral decay, blamed progressive education, blamed the supposed softness of American youth. Some called for the prisoners to be declared traitors, to be stripped of their citizenship. Others expressed sympathy, suggesting the men had been brainwashed and were not responsible for their choices. The military was deeply troubled. The refusal of the 23 suggested serious problems with military training, with prisoner of war training, with the way America prepared its soldiers for the possibility of capture. The Army launched studies to understand what had happened. They interviewed returned POWs, asking about conditions in the camps, about collaboration and resistance, about the indoctrination program. The findings were disturbing. The studies found that American POWs in Korea had behaved worse than prisoners in previous wars. There had been higher rates of collaboration, higher death rates from disease and despair, less organized resistance. The studies suggested several reasons. First, American soldiers in Korea were not as well trained or motivated as soldiers in World War II. The Korean War was not popular, the stakes were not clear, soldiers did not have the same sense of fighting a necessary war against a clear evil. Second, soldiers had received no training in how to resist interrogation or indoctrination. They simply were not prepared for what the communists did to them. Third, the breakdown of unit cohesion and leadership in the camps meant that junior enlisted men were left without support or guidance. The Army's response was to develop a new program called Code of Conduct Training. This code, formally established in 1955, laid out specific rules for how American military personnel should behave if captured. The Code of Conduct included 6 articles. The first stated that a soldier will never surrender of his own free will, that if in command, he will never surrender his unit while it can still fight. The second stated that if captured, a soldier will continue to resist by all means available, will make every effort to escape. The third required giving only name, rank, service number, and date of birth to interrogators, the so-called Big Four. The fourth prohibited accepting special favors or parole from the enemy. The fifth prohibited making statements disloyal to the United States or giving information harmful to the country. The sixth required faith in fellow prisoners and the United States. This code of conduct was a direct response to what happened in Korea. It was designed to give soldiers clear guidelines, to strengthen their resolve, to prepare them psychologically for the possibility of capture. All military personnel were required to memorize the code of conduct, and prisoner of war resistance training became a standard part of military preparation. The military also developed SERE training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, which subjected soldiers to simulated capture and interrogation to prepare them for what they might face. But what happened to the 23 Americans who refused repatriation? In January 1954, after the period in the neutral zone ended, 21 of them went to China. 2 changed their minds at the last minute and returned to the United States, but 21 followed through on their decision. They were taken to China, where they were initially treated as heroes, as proof that even Americans could see the superiority of communism. They were given housing, jobs, and opportunities to study. Several enrolled in Chinese universities. The Chinese government used them for propaganda, parading them before cameras, having them make statements praising China and criticizing America. But the reality of life in China quickly became disillusioning for most of them. China in the 1950s was not the paradise the propaganda had portrayed. It was a poor country, still recovering from years of civil war and Japanese invasion. Living conditions were harsh. Food was scarce. The political atmosphere was oppressive. Mao Zedong's government was in the middle of massive social and economic campaigns that caused enormous suffering. The Great Leap Forward, which began in 1958, would cause a famine that killed tens of millions of Chinese. The Americans in China were insulated from the worst of this, but they could not escape the reality that they were living in a totalitarian state. The Americans also found that they were not really free. They were monitored constantly by Chinese security services. Their movements were restricted. They were expected to continue to make propaganda statements, to participate in events glorifying communism. They were used as tools, not treated as genuine equals. Some of the men married Chinese women, but even these marriages were arranged or encouraged by the government for propaganda purposes. Most of the 21 became increasingly disillusioned. They missed America. They missed their families. They realized they had made a terrible mistake, but getting out was difficult. They had renounced America, had made propaganda statements against their country. How could they go back? Would they be prosecuted? Would they be welcomed? And practically, how could they even leave China? The Chinese government was not eager to let them go because their defection back to America would be a propaganda defeat. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, several of the men were trying to return. They contacted American embassies, wrote letters to their families, asked for help. The U.S. government, after some debate, decided to allow them to return without prosecution. The thinking was that prosecuting them would be difficult given the circumstances of their original decision, and that allowing them to return would itself be a propaganda victory, showing that America was forgiving and that the men recognized their mistake. Slowly, the men came home. Some returned in the late 1950s. Others came back in the 1960s. A few stayed in China permanently, either because they had completely committed to their decision or because they felt they had burned their bridges and could never truly return. But most came home, usually quietly, without publicity. They returned to an America that had largely forgotten about them, to families who sometimes welcomed them and sometimes rejected them, to lives that were often difficult and troubled. The men who returned faced enormous challenges. They had to rebuild their lives, find jobs, reconnect with families. Many struggled with guilt over their decision, with anger at themselves and at the communists who had manipulated them. They often faced suspicion and hostility from others who saw them as traitors. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to cope. Some had failed marriages and troubled relationships. Most lived quiet, obscure lives, trying to put their past behind them. One of the 21 was Corporal Edward Dickinson, who had been 20 years old when he was captured. He was from the South, from a poor family, had little education. In the POW camp, he had become a progressive, had cooperated with the Chinese, had been convinced that communism offered a better life. He went to China in 1954, lived there for about 4 years, and then became disillusioned. He managed to get back to America in 1958. He told reporters that he had made a mistake, that he had been fooled by communist propaganda, that he was happy to be home. But his life never really recovered. He struggled to find steady work, had difficulty maintaining relationships, and lived with the stigma of his decision for the rest of his life. Another was Corporal Claude Batchelor, who had also been a progressive in the camps. Batchelor went to China but returned to the United States in 1955. Unlike the others, Batchelor was court-martialed. He was charged with collaboration with the enemy. The court-martial heard evidence about his activities in the camp, the propaganda statements he had made, the ways he had cooperated with the Chinese. Batchelor was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, though the sentence was later reduced, and he was released after serving a few years. The Batchelor case was controversial because it seemed to single out one man for behavior that many others had also engaged in to varying degrees. The case of Corporal Rothwell Floyd was different. Floyd went to China and stayed. He married a Chinese woman, had children, and built a life there. He appeared in Chinese propaganda films and statements over the years. He never returned to America. Whether he remained a true believer in communism or simply felt he could not go back, or perhaps some combination of both, is unclear. He lived out his life in China, one of the very few who never came home. The story of the 21 who refused repatriation became a subject of intense study and debate. Psychologists, sociologists, and military analysts tried to understand what had happened. How had these men been turned? Was it really brainwashing, or was it something else? The studies found a complex picture. Some of the men had been genuine believers, at least for a time. They had internalized communist ideology, had come to see America as an imperialist aggressor, had convinced themselves that China offered a better path. Others had never really believed, but had been confused, isolated, afraid, and had made a decision under pressure that they later regretted. The studies also found that the men who refused repatriation shared certain characteristics. They tended to be young, poorly educated, from troubled backgrounds. Many had difficult relationships with their families. Some had been in trouble before joining the military. They were men who were vulnerable, who lacked strong ties to American society, who were looking for something to believe in. The communists had identified these vulnerabilities and exploited them. But the studies also found that the vast majority of American POWs, even those who had been subjected to the same indoctrination program, had resisted. Thousands of American prisoners had endured years of captivity, had been exposed to the same propaganda, had faced the same pressures, and had remained loyal. They had maintained their identity as Americans, had refused to be broken, and had come home. The 21 were the exceptions, not the rule. The concept of brainwashing became deeply embedded in American culture after Korea. It became an explanation for why people joined cults, why kidnapping victims sometimes identified with their captors, why people adopted beliefs that seemed contrary to their interests. The idea that minds could be washed, that people could be programmed like machines, became a source of fascination and fear. In reality, what happened in Korea was not mind control in some science fiction sense. It was psychological manipulation, coercion, and exploitation of vulnerability. It was effective in some cases, but it was not irresistible, and it did not change people's fundamental nature so much as it exploited weaknesses that were already there. The experience of American POWs in Korea led to major changes in how the military prepared soldiers for the possibility of capture. The Code of Conduct provided clear guidelines. SERE training gave soldiers experience in resisting interrogation. The military emphasized unit cohesion, leadership, and the importance of maintaining discipline even in captivity. These changes paid off in later wars. American POWs in Vietnam, while subjected to brutal treatment and intense pressure, generally behaved better than those in Korea. The breakdown of discipline and the level of collaboration seen in Korea were not repeated to the same extent. The broader question of why some men broke and others resisted remains difficult to answer completely. Human behavior under extreme stress is complex. Some people have more psychological